Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Conquerors Podcast, Episode 6.1 Egypt and the Other Land of the Nile. Last episode, we finished covering the reign and conquest of perhaps the greatest of the kings of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser III. This doesn't mean that we're done with the Assyrians, as Tiglath-Pileser's successors, building on the strong foundations laid by the great reformer, didn't just kick back and relax on the throne. Their story, however, will have to wait, as the story of our next two great conquerors takes us back to the land of the Nile. Now, whenever someone says the land of the Nile, the first thing that usually pops up in one's mind, mine included, is Egypt. And for obvious reasons. During most of the Nile's history, Egypt was the greatest, strongest, and most influential of the lands that lay along the banks of the Great River. But being that we are talking about the longest river in the world, with a total length of 6,650 kilometers give or take, the ancient Egyptians were just one of the many people that dwelt along its banks throughout human history. One such people, who were as ancient as the Egyptians, were the Nubians. The Nubians were a people and a civilization that formed along the banks of the central Nile Valley, to the south of the lands inhabited by the ancient Egyptians. Despite later being overshadowed by their northern neighbor, from the time of their formation to the time that they came to be dominated by the ancient Egyptians during the Middle Kingdom period, the Nubian civilization was as advanced and as sophisticated as that of the Egyptians. But before we dig into their history, and how they eventually came to dominate their great northern neighbor, we have to first continue the story of the ancient Egyptians from where we left off in episode 4.3, at the death of the greatest warrior pharaoh in history, the Hatmos III, when the new kingdom of Egypt had evolved into a true empire and was at the height of its political, military, and economic power, and was probably the strongest state in the world. Although the reigns of Thutmose's three successors were relatively peaceful, Egypt's international influence and prestige continued to increase. Even its relationship with the Mitanni improved, to the point that the two great rivals became allies during the reign of Amenhotep III. What little military action that did occur was primarily that of suppression of rebellions in Syria and Nubia. Egypt's economy and culture also prospered, reaching new heights during the reign of Amenhotep III, who is known as Amenhotep the Magnificent. Like any empire, however, the good times were not to last. The first major threat to Egypt was the re-emergence of the Hittites in Anatolia during the reign of Amenhotep III. After more than 2 centuries of decline, the Hittites had rebuilt their kingdom and began to expand, raiding the lands of the Mitanni. Amenhotep, either unwilling to commit to a war so far from Egypt, or misjudging the threat posed by the Hittites, or a combination of both, failed to respond to this new threat or to sufficiently help his Mitanni allies. In time, the Hittites would go on to defeat and supplant the Mitanni in northern Syria, pitting the Egyptians against an enemy that was far more warlike and expansionist than they have ever faced. The greatest threat to Egypt, however, proved to be an internal one. In 1351 BC, Amenhotep III died, and was succeeded by his son, Amenhotep IV. This Amenhotep would go on to be remembered by another name, Akhenaten, whose meaning was effective for the Aten. The reason for him taking that name was Akhenaten's attempt to promote Atenism, or the worship of the god Aten. It's not completely understood today whether he was looking for a mere promotion of Aten to some sort of status of first among the gods, or whether he was aiming for some form of monotheism at the expense of the traditional Egyptian polytheism. In his attempt to promote his new religion, Akhenaten even ordered the construction of a new capital for the kingdom, which was to be dedicated to his patron god, and to whom he gave the name of Akhetaten. The other, more famous name for which the city is known is Amarna. We won't get into too much detail here, but in short, Akhenaten's policies were very, very unpopular, and after his death, his monuments were dismantled and hidden, his statues were destroyed, his shiny and very costly new capital was abandoned, and his name excluded from lists of rulers compiled by later pharaohs who went so far as to refer to him as the enemy or that criminal. Many Egyptologists date the beginning of Egypt's decline back to Akhenaten's reign, And in the short term, things really went pretty bad for the Egyptians, as a period of close to 40 years of turmoil that Egyptologists call the Amarna period followed. For most of this period, chaos reigned, as the two sons and successors of Akhenaten died young, probably assassinated, and the position of pharaoh was occupied by men not of royal blood. Fun fact, one of Akhenaten's aforementioned sons and later successor was the famous Tutankhamun, whose undisturbed grave turned him to perhaps the world's most famous pharaoh. What many don't know is that his original name was Tutankhaten, which means living image of Aten. So unpopular was his father and his policies that he changed his name as part of his attempts to restore the ancient Egyptian religion and distance himself from his father. On the long term, Akhenaten's unpopular policies caused the people to stop looking at their pharaohs as the living representative of their gods, and start looking for a more personal relationship with their gods, no doubt causing damage to the image, authority, and halo of untouchability of the divine pharaoh. Also, Akhenaten's focus on promoting his new religion diverted the state's focus and resources from the empire's frontiers and armies, weakening its influence and allowed its enemies to gather their strength. But Egypt would not give up so easily, and at the end of the Amarna period, the position of pharaoh finally fell to capable hands, when Ramesses I, founder of the 19th dynasty and grandfather of that Ramesses, assumed the throne and restored stability. Luckily for Egypt, because that meant that the task of dealing with the greatest enemy the Egyptians had ever faced, the Hittites, would fall on Ramesses I and his two immediate successors, who would prove to be two of the greatest and most famous pharaohs in Egypt's history, Seti I and, of course, Ramesses II. Seti I was the son of Ramesses I, and being that Ramesses I was already an old man at the time he assumed the throne, Seti was already heavily involved in the day-to-day matters of the state. When he assumed the throne, Seti embarked on a series of campaigns against the Hittites in Canaan and Syria in order to re-establish Egyptian dominance there. Although he wasn't able to completely defeat the Hittites, he did manage to reconquer most of Egypt's lost territories and the territories disputed with the Hittites, including a minor town in Syria called Kadesh. He also campaigned in the west against the growing threat of the Libyans. Internally, Seti saw to the restoration of order and royal authority in the realm. Seti I was succeeded by his son, Ramesses II, who is also known as Ramesses the Great, who would go on to prove himself to be as ambitious and energetic as his father. During his long reign, Egyptian armies campaigned on all fronts. His most famous campaign was undoubtedly the campaign against the Hittites, launched in his 5th regnal year, which saw the great pharaoh personally lead his armies at the Battle of Kadesh. This battle was massive by ancient standards, with modern estimates of more than 25,000 men on each side. This battle is also considered the largest chariot battle in history, with more than 5,000 chariots taking part in the battle. Although he eventually gained the upper hand, Ramesses wasn't able to capture Kadesh, nor maintain Egyptian gains. This campaign eventually resulted in the Treaty of Kadesh, the oldest known peace treaty in the world. Although no doubt a great warrior pharaoh, I didn't include Ramesses in this podcast since most of his campaigns did not result in any significant territorial gain for the empire. And although he managed to check the Hittites' advance, he wasn't able to reconquer any significant territory lost to them. Culturally and economically, however, his reign is considered as the last golden age of ancient Egypt, during which the empire reached the height of its international prestige, with tributes and gifts sent from many lands to the great pharaoh. Meanwhile, construction projects on a massive scale were launched, and the kingdom prospered. I mean, you don't get the title the Great for nothing. Ramesses went on to rule for an unprecedented 62 years, dying at an age of over 90. This in itself, however, presented a problem, as the pharaoh outlived many of his sons, and his eventual successor, Merneptah, was close to 70 when he inherited the throne. After his short reign, the kingdom fell to chaos when two of his sons fought for the throne, as both declared themselves pharaohs. They in turn were followed by the short and very unstable reigns of Siptah and Twarset. With Twarset's death, we don't know for sure if it was from natural causes or murder, the throne was seized by Pharaoh Setnakhte, who founded the 20th dynasty of Egypt. It is here that I have to say that I wasn't able to find out how, especially during the intermediate periods, Egyptologists and historians decided on grouping a certain group of rulers to a royal dynasty, while others weren't, especially in cases where the members of this so-called dynasty weren't even related. A major example of this is the so-called 24th dynasty, which I don't really get how it was included as one of the royal dynasties, since neither the number of rulers, 2, its duration, 12 years, nor the territory it controlled, it was basically a city-state, were that significant. Okay, back to Setnakhte. Setnakhte reigned for a short period of 3 years, before being succeeded by his son, Ramesses III. An energetic and brave warrior pharaoh, Ramesses III is considered as the last great pharaoh to rule Egypt. Luckily for Egypt, as Ramesses III's reign coincided with a pivotal period in Egypt's history, the Bronze Age collapse, and had a lesser man ascended the throne, Egypt's collapse would have come far sooner. As mentioned in episode 5.1, The Rise of Assyria, this mysterious period was one that saw violent and sudden upheavals in societies and trade across the Near East, Anatolia, North Africa, the Caucasus, the Balkans, and the Eastern Mediterranean, and resulted in either a major decline or total collapse of several civilizations, including, of course, that of the new Kingdom of Egypt. It also saw the destruction of many coastal settlements across the Eastern Mediterranean at the hands of a mysterious people, the Sea People. And soon after Ramesses III ascended the throne, these Sea People began attacking Egypt itself. The warrior pharaoh rose to the challenge, gathering all resources at his disposal, and in 2 great battles, one by land and the other taking place in the Nile Delta, he personally led his armies to victory. These victories, however, were costly. Egypt was never a warrior society, and its economy was not capable of maintaining large forces in the field for extended periods of time. And with its fortunes already on the decline, these lengthy wars and the need to maintain large forces in Egypt itself exhausted the treasury. Also, with the focus shifted to protecting Egypt itself, the empire's hold on the Asian provinces weakened, further diminishing the tribute and resources the empire received. The economic decline was further worsened by a grain shortage across the kingdom that would continue to plague the empire for many years. Perhaps history would have turned different had Ramesses lived longer. Unfortunately for the new kingdom, however, its last truly great pharaoh was assassinated in a plot organized by one of his wives in an attempt to secure the throne to her son. The plot failed, however, and Ramesses' choice for an heir eventually ascended the throne. Ramesses III's successor, also shockingly named Ramesses, was already involved in the affairs of state during his father's reign and showed promise, but he unfortunately died after just 6 years. With his death, a period of decline for the dynasty followed, as the later pharaohs of the dynasty were unable to hold the kingdom's decline. The Asian provinces were soon lost, while the economy struggled, and the pharaoh's authority declined, being lost to the bureaucrats, provincial governors, and the clergy. In 870 BC, Ramesses, 11th of his name, last pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, died, thus beginning a period historians called the Third Intermediate Period. Like the 2 similarly called periods that preceded it, this period was one of economic and political instability, during most of which the kingdom was again divided. This division began with the founder of the 21st dynasty, whose authority as the successor of Ramesses XI was recognized in Lower Egypt only, while the high priest of the Temple of Amun, located in Thebes, effectively ruled Middle and Upper Egypt. This dynasty lasted for about 135 years, before being replaced, in unexplained circumstances, by the 22nd dynasty. This dynasty was founded by one Shishonq, who was of Libyan ethnicity, though apparently fully Egyptianized. The Libyans had been settling across Lower Egypt for the last century, and like many minorities throughout history, were forming an increasingly bigger part of the Egyptian army, before one of them eventually seized the throne. And for a while, it appears that Shishonq was even able to unite most of Lower and Upper Egypt. But although the kingdom prospered again, and unity was established, this unified realm was but a shadow of what it was during the New Kingdom. And the further south one went, the less that the control of the dynasty extended beyond the Nile. Eventually, internal squabbling split the dynasty, with the 22nd continuing to rule in the north, and the 23rd dynasty breaking away and establishing itself in Thebes. By the middle of the 8th century BC, Egypt was in a more fragmented state than it ever was during its 2,000-year-long history. By now, the 22nd and 23rd dynasties had both declined, and their territories extended little beyond their respective capitals, with the vacuum being filled by more and more independent city-states, each ruled by a local ruler. One of these local dynasties was the aforementioned and insignificant 24th dynasty. It is here, at the lowest point in Egypt's history, that we travel south, to introduce the other land of the Nile, because as Egypt's fortunes declined, its longtime vassal/province of Nubia was on the rise. And before we get to the story of the new native kingdom that was rising in Nubia, we have to cover the history of that mysterious land. As I mentioned at the start of this episode, Nubia was an ancient land. The region that came to be known as Nubia lay immediately to the south of ancient Egypt, stretching south from the first cataract of the Nile to the confluence of the Blue and White Niles, south of the modern-day Sudanese capital of Khartoum. Human settlement in Nubia dates back to more than 300,000 years, while agricultural societies began to form around 6000 BC. Around 2500 BC, that is, around the time of the Old Kingdom period in Egypt, the Kerma civilization began to form in what came to be Upper or Southern Nubia, while around 2300 BC, the similar C group culture began appearing in Lower Nubia. By the end of the 3rd millennium BC, these two had developed into the centralized kingdom of Kerma to the south, and a number of small states to the north. These distinct, sophisticated civilizations, in their early days at least, rivaled their Egyptian neighbors to the north, and relations between the three, especially in the form of trade, is recorded throughout the 3rd millennium BC. These relations, and their implications, would last for millennia, and one could say that they last even to this day. The peaceful nature of the relation between the Egyptians and Nubians, however, changed at the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, with the rise of the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. This dynasty brought the power of ancient Egypt to new heights, and now wished to project this power outwards, and Lower Nubia, a land divided on the one hand, and rich in many resources, especially gold on the other, made for the perfect target. Thus, through numerous military expeditions, construction of forts and military garrisons, and the establishment of mining colonies, Lower Nubia was slowly incorporated and Egyptianized. In the meantime, the strength and wealth of the kingdom of Kerma continued to increase, and it began to raid Lower Nubia. This situation would continue until the beginning of the 18th century BC, which saw the fall of the 12th dynasty of Egypt and the rise of the 13th and 14th dynasties. The rulers of these dynasties were generally weaker, and this period saw the start of decline of Egyptian power. In Lower Nubia, Egyptian forts and garrisons were slowly abandoned, soon to be occupied by the Kerma kingdom, because as Egyptian power declined, Nubian power was on the rise. Unfortunately, very few Kerma sources survive to us from this period, and we know very little about the internal matters of the kingdom. Hell, we don't even have a list of the kings of Kerma, and most of what we do know comes to us from the ancient Egyptian sources. Still, the Kerma culture was a sophisticated one, with its own architecture, pantheon of gods, and funerary rites and customs. It was also a militaristic one, especially compared to the northern neighbor, as attested by the many bronze weapons found in graves, indicating the importance of that aspect in the Kerma society. The backbone of the Kerma army was the archer, and Nubian archers were both sought after and feared by the Egyptians. Anyway, things continued to go downhill for the Egyptians. Semitic-speaking people have been settling in northern Egypt in increasing numbers for the last century, and soon, one such people, called the Hyksos, invaded and occupied northern Egypt, founding the 15th dynasty, and starting the period known as the Second Intermediate Period, or the Hyksos period. Since this episode is about Nubia's history, I will cover this period from its point of view. But for any of you who wants to hear more about this period from the Egyptian point of view, check out episode 4.1. During this period, the kingdom of Kerma reached the height of its power. The population of the kingdom rose, trade increased, and massive construction projects, especially royal tombs, were launched. The kingdom continued to expand north until it controlled all of Nubia proper. Soon, however, Kerma moved from being a passive beneficiary of Egypt's decline to an active contributor, with forces of the kingdom raiding deeper and deeper into Upper Egypt. Finding a common purpose, they made contact with the Hyksos, perhaps even assisting them in their war against the 16th dynasty of Egypt. This dynasty had followed the 13th dynasty and also ruled from Thebes. After a long war, the Hyksos defeated this dynasty, bringing an end to it and sacking Thebes. This act, however, would prove to be the beginning of the end for both the Hyksos and the Kerma, because soon a new dynasty rose in its stead in Thebes, the 17th dynasty. After a period of consolidation, a pharaoh by the name of Seknen Ra'ta'a assumed the throne in Thebes and launched a war of liberation against the Hyksos. This war, and the expulsion of the foreign Hyksos, would go on to become an obsession of his and his sons. War was also waged against the Nubians, who continued to raid deeper into southern Egypt, with raids recorded as far as Nekheb, modern-day El-Kab, which was less than 80 kilometers from Thebes. The Egyptians, in some sort of cultural superiority and snobbery I have to say, would remember these attacks, and would seek revenge against the Nubians for their assistance of the foreign occupiers of Egypt. After suffering a gruesome death at the hands of the Hyksos, either in battle or by execution after a battle, Seknen Ra''s son Kamose assumed the throne. He continued his father's war with even more zeal, assaulting the Hyksos by land and river, slowly but steadily pushing the borders north. According to a stele that dates to Kamose's reign, the situation of the Hyksos became so bad that they sent messengers to the Kerma asking for a two-front attack against the Egyptians, indicating that a formal alliance between the Hyksos and the Kerma existed. These, however, were intercepted by Kamose, preventing such an attack from being launched. Although Kamose died shortly afterwards, his reign marked a shift in the balance of power, with the Egyptians back on the offensive and the Hyksos and the Kerma on the defensive. Kamose was succeeded by his brother, Ahmose I, who went on to become a great conqueror on his own, and the hero of episode 4.2. He brought the war with the Hyksos to a successful end, conquering Avaris and mopping up any further resistance. With Egypt once again unified, and a veteran army under his command, Ahmose sought to expand his kingdom north to Canaan, and of course south to Nubia. And as I said before, for the Egyptians, the war with Nubia wasn't just for the sake of expansion, it was also for revenge. Unfortunately, we don't have any surviving Kerma sources that cover the war from their point of view, meaning that we have to rely on the Egyptian sources, which are obviously biased toward the righteous, vengeance-driven Egyptians. What is obvious is that, despite being at the height of its power, the Kerma were unable to face a unified Egypt, which was now free to focus on one front. To that we add the fact that Ahmose now led an experienced, battle-hardened army that was equipped with the finest weapons of its day. The campaign began around 1527 BC, with the Nubians being led by a king called Ata. As stated in the Egyptian sources, quote, "Then Ata, a Nubian king, came to the south. His fate brought on his doom. The gods of Upper Egypt grasped him. He was found by His Majesty at Tent Ta'a. His Majesty carried him off as a living captive, and all his people as booty." End quote. The sources then go on to say that after defeating the Kerma king, the people rallied behind another king, who seems to have been a native Egyptian. Quote, "Then came the foe named Titian. He had gathered the malcontents to himself. His Majesty slew him. His troop was wiped out." End quote. The Egyptians were obviously victorious, and Ahmose expanded his kingdom to the second cataract of the Nile, with a new administrative center being established at Buhin, while the remaining areas to the south were turned to vassals. After this campaign, the kingdom of Kerma started to decline, while Egypt entered its greatest era, the New Kingdom, under Hatmos and his successors. As we discussed in previous episode, this era saw Egypt expand to its greatest territorial extent, including in Nubia. The next pharaoh to campaign in Nubia was Hatmos I. His first campaign was the result of a rebellion in Lower Nubia, supported by the Kerma. The warrior pharaoh personally led his army, and according to the tomb inscriptions of Ahmose son of Ibana, our main source for that period, Hatmos personally killed the Kerma king before having his body hung from the prow of his ship on his return journey to Thebes. 2 years later, Hatmos launched a second campaign, with the aim of consolidating Egyptian rule in Lower Nubia. To support this, the pharaoh ordered a canal at the First Cataract, built during the Middle Kingdom period, to be dredged, in order to facilitate easier travel upstream from Egypt to Nubia. This campaign, however, seems to have been more of a military tour of the king. I say that because the Nubians were obviously not impressed by this campaign, and soon, a new, bigger rebellion erupted. Hatmos, no doubt furious at this point, marched back south, with the aim of bringing any Nubian hope for independence to an end this time. After crushing the rebellion in Lower Nubia, he continued his march south, marching further than any Egyptian army had ever before. Whatever forces the Kerma were able to gather were quickly destroyed, and even their capital, also called Kerma, was captured. To consolidate both existing and new conquests, and prevent any further Nubian revolts, Hatmos led an intensive campaign of Egyptianization in the new territories. He also formally established the province of Kush, that included all territory between the First and the Third Cataracts of the Nile. That the governor of this province was a personal appointment of the pharaoh himself, and that he was known as the king's son of Kush, gives us a pretty good indication of the importance of the new province. The remaining territories to the south of the new province were organized as military frontiers of the expanding empire. Hatmos's policies were continued by his successors, and ended up being so successful that they effectively brought an end to the Kerma kingdom and culture, and any dreams of Nubian independence for the next 400 years. In the coming decades, the Egyptians kept pushing south, so that by the reign of the greatest warrior pharaoh, Hatmos III, the Egyptian empire stretched as far south as the Fourth Cataract, with raids perhaps extending even beyond. And despite some small-scale rebellions here and there, up until the reign of Ramses XI, Nubia formed an integral part of the empire, not just economically, but also militarily, as the new province formed a major recruiting ground, and spiritually, as one certain site, called Jebel Barkal, located at one of the southernmost parts of the empire, became the center of major pharaonic ceremonies. As a sign of this importance, Hatmos III founded a new administrative center close to Jebel Barkal, Napata. And for the remainder of the new kingdom, the province of Kush prospered. And indeed, very little, juicy information about that part of the empire survives, indicating that for the most part, there was nothing to record. Egyptian rule must have been a lenient one, as for the most part, the natives seemed to have been content. Revolts were rare and on a small scale. Egyptian culture was accepted and slowly adopted, not just by the elites, but by the whole population, and the major urban centers, most importantly for our story, Napata, grew. As I mentioned before, however, after the reign of Ramses III, things for the most part went downhill for Egypt. Still, even in the time of troubles that followed, when Canaan slipped from Egyptian control, Nubia seems to have remained quiet for the most part. It was only after the death of Ramses XI, when Egypt was once again divided and Upper Egypt and Nubia fell under the control of the high priest of Amun in Thebes, that the Nubians began to act increasingly autonomous, and that the notion of Nubian independence re-emerged. And the center for this notion was none other than Napata, the Egyptian-built capital of Nubia. We'll stop here today. Next episode, we'll continue the story of the rise of Nubia from here, in Napata, where soon an Egyptianized native noble by the name of Alara would go on to found a small independent Nubian kingdom. We will then cover the reigns of Alara's two successors, our next two great conquerors, who would soon turn their eyes north and turn the tables of history. See you in the next one.